Hello, and welcome to Ed Infinitum, the podcast that makes school the subject of study. I'm your host, David Nuremberg. This is Season 1, Episode number 7, Why Tracking Has to Go and What Could Take Its Place. Before we begin, a quick note that most of this episode was drawn from an article of mine that was published in the National Council of Teachers of English journal, English Education, in 2016. Honors classes, AP classes, remedial classes, college prep classes. If these designations sound familiar to you, I'm not surprised. Tracking and other practices of homogeneously grouping students by so-called ability level remain the norm in American classrooms. This despite decades of research highlighting how they can disserve and even harm student learning. Heterogeneous grouping, by contrast, benefits struggling learners, a conclusion supported by a substantial body of research. Some of that research cautions, though, that these benefits might be perceived as coming at the expense of higher-performing classmates' learning. In other words, don't take away tracking and ability leveling, or the smart kids are going to really suffer. In this episode, I'm going to attempt to complicate that position just a little bit. First, let's begin with the fact that there is really no such thing as a homogeneous classroom. As Piney Branch Elementary School principal Bertram Gitterlet once put it, one kid is a homogeneous group. As soon as you bring another student in, you have differences. And the question is, how do you capitalize on those differences? Teachers who recognize that heterogeneity, difference, is inherent in any classroom, no matter what the discipline or grade or how ostensibly tracked it is by so-called ability level, face the need to employ some form of what we call differentiated instruction. Now, from the beginning of this episode, I want to challenge the use, however prevalent, of the phrase ability level, because it has these implications, intentional or not, that different students somehow possess different inherent capacities for learning. With everything we know today about neuroplasticity and learning theory, well, it argues clearly against such determinism, except in the most extreme cases. I prefer Carol Tomlinson's term, readiness level, which presents a picture of students who, at a given moment in time, may be more or less able to succeed at a certain task than their peers, but who are nevertheless capable of eventually attaining sufficient skill or knowledge to meet whatever standard or benchmark you want them to. Still, so much of the educational literature still uses that rhetoric of ability, so sometimes I'll wind up quoting passages that use that sort of phrasing, and I just want to ask you to, in your mind, try and substitute the word and concept of readiness whenever we're talking about ability. Now, the bulk of criticism of tracking or other similar forms of sorting students by perceived ability argues in one way, shape, or form that it's bad for students categorized at lower readiness levels. But one of the chief arguments against heterogeneous grouping is that it provides insufficient challenge for, or even stifles, highly motivated, highly capable, or so-called gifted students. At the school where I teach, an additional motive also arose to challenge heterogeneous grouping, that it denies the additional GPA boost that a course designated as honors or AP often confers. When college admissions is on the line, parents understandably want every advantage for their kids that they can get. So, due in no small part to those parental concerns, our until then non-leveled English curriculum was forced to become an ability-leveled model. In the former system, beginning in the spring semester of sophomore year, all English offerings were electives open to students of all readiness levels. Many electives were heterogeneous by grade level as well, open to both juniors and seniors. But with this new system, we had to eliminate all elective classes, except for those in the second semester of senior year, replacing them with a single class per grade, following a single curriculum that could be delivered at either the college prep or a more rigorous honors level. I've polled my students in the years since the change, and the majority consistently say that they'd prefer the choice of variety of thematically based elective courses over the present configuration, but they also value and want the opportunity to be challenged and to earn honors credit. And they've articulated there in microcosm some of the promise as well as the challenge of heterogeneity. I'm going to try and argue that there's a middle path, or more accurately, a synthesis of leveled and heterogeneous classes that could offer a both-and solution, embedding the chance to earn an honors distinction within an otherwise non-leveled heterogeneous course. I'm going to argue that this has the potential to allow students entering at lower readiness levels to avoid the negative effects of tracking and to reap the benefits of studying alongside higher performing peers, but also will support and enable those higher performing students to learn at the advanced levels they need and desire, and if necessary, to earn those extra points on their GPA that they desire as well. So let's talk about tracking, the sorting of students by perceived subject-specific ability levels. It's been the dominant practice in all major subjects in most American public schools. The theory of tracking is that it permits teachers to tailor instruction to the ability level of their students. And for the last half century, a steady supply of research has yielded evidence that such groupings not only failed to deliver on this promise, but also produce unintended consequences. In response to this criticism, the practice of tracking declined during the 1990s, but experienced a resurgence in the 2000s, likely in response to pressures exerted by the No Child Left Behind Act. Or perhaps, as was the case with my school, an increased perception among parents that college admissions is becoming more and more difficult. Now, I realize I'm playing a little fast and loose with vocabulary here. The terms tracking, grouping, leveling, streaming, phasing, they all have shades of difference, but whenever I use any of these phrases, I'm basically referring to the practice of students, either by choice or compulsion, enrolling in classes designed to be homogeneous by readiness level. In the end, it doesn't really matter. A 2004 review of the research confirms that any grouping by perceived ability level creates stratification, which leads to, and I quote, unequal distribution of resources, curriculum, materials, professional expertise to students, and undermines efforts to achieve educational equity. Now, research in the social sciences is always a little tricky, and it's almost impossible to really conclusively determine anything, but ability grouping in one way, shape, or form has literally been studied more than any other single subject in education, and the overwhelming consensus is that it's bad for students. And sort of the OG of this research is Jeannie Oakes. In her 1985 book, Keeping Track, How Schools Structure Inequality, she studied more than 300 leveled high school English and mathematics classes, and I'm going to summarize and expand a little bit upon her key findings as follows. Number one, there wasn't a lot of evidence that the learning of high-achieving students benefited from being in a homogeneous group. Number two, there was substantial evidence that the learning of students at lower readiness levels was negatively affected by being placed in a class only filled with other students at low readiness levels. Subsequent studies found that stigmatization can occur, creating negative impacts on students' academic performance in lower level classes, and that tracking can even retard student learning, particularly with students at the low end of the readiness level. It makes a certain amount of sense. If you're told from the outset that you're not bright, people shouldn't be surprised when you perform up or down to their expectations. Number three, negative socio-emotional effects were observed as well. According to survey responses, students placed in lower-level classes did not develop positive attitudes about their classmates or about their own agency in learning and school achievement. Worse, their teachers' and peers' perceptions of them pretty much tracked with their own. Lower-level students tended to have lower aspirations and feel more frustrated about their plans for the future. And this also was confirmed by a lot of subsequent research. Number four, as anyone who's spent any time in a lower-level class, even just a quick visit, can tell you, behavior problems increase in low-track classes, even among students who don't exhibit behavior problems in higher or non-track classes. Once again, this was found in previous and subsequent research. Number five, as you can probably imagine, poor and minority students were largely overrepresented in low-ability tracks and continue to be this day. They're underrepresented in programs for the gifted and talented, even when dealing with black students and white students with very similar test scores and demonstrated capabilities. Statistically, teachers are twice as likely to recommend that white student for a higher ability tracked class than the black student. And white teachers, who remain the overwhelming majority in school faculties, were more likely to make this unfair determination than teachers of color. The correlations between placement, social class, race, and ethnicity is present regardless of the basis for placement. Test scores, counselor and teacher recommendations, even student and parent choice. A testament, I suppose, to the power of internalized racism. Number six, the only consistent, statistically significant benefit of leveling that Oakes found was that teachers reported enjoying teaching honors classes more than they reported enjoying teaching non-honors classes. Follow-up studies found that the very label advanced or remedial affects teachers' treatment of students, as well as students' images of themselves. Which again, isn't super surprising. Think about teacher Jane Elliott's famous experiment from the 1960s, when she divided her students by eye color and told them that the people with blue eyes were smarter, faster, better than the people with brown eyes. Inevitably, the students started acting up or down to the expectations placed upon them. All of this research led the Carnegie Council on Adolescent Development to recommend the elimination of all tracking in schools serving early adolescents in 1989. After 10 more years of research, the National Research Council, the oldest and most well-respected advisory body to the U.S. government on academic research and one of the early advocates of No Child Left Behind, formally advised against ability grouping in general, testifying before Congress that they had found, quote, considerable information that challenges the efficacy and fairness of placing students in typical low-track environments that are starved of intellectual or social stimulation. Hence, we conclude that we cannot justify these kinds of placements. This was 1999, probably the apogee of the backlash against tracking movement. A 1986 Johns Hopkins survey found that ability groupings were present in at least 80% of elementary schools, but by the mid-1990s, those groupings had dropped to as low as 27%. Then, we had a comeback. In 2006, ability grouping was back to 63% of teachers, and by 2009, 71%. Much blame for this trend can be laid on the shoulders of No Child Left Behind, and you can listen to episodes 3 and 4 if you want to hear more about how that panned out. But part of the reason why ability grouping has so much inertia lies in the perceived shortcomings of heterogeneous classes, especially for some high-achieving populations of students. While acknowledging that tracking for many students yields no particular scholastic benefits, some studies found that substantial gains were present among high-readiness students placed in specially tailored classrooms. Other studies found that high-readiness students performed more poorly when joined with students at lower levels of readiness. One 1996 study put it starkly, quote, abolishing tracking in America's schools would have a large positive impact on achievement for students currently in the lower tracks, unquote, but they caution that this could come at the expense of students in higher tracks. The perception persists among many that, and I'm quoting now from a 2015 article, when advanced students are paired with lower achieving students for group assignments, it's the smart kids who do the bulk of the work, end quote. Now, these are not necessarily universally agreed upon phenomena. For example, the National Middle School Association found that with the use of effective heterogeneous pedagogy, not only can students at low readiness levels see a boost, but also, quote, gifted learners can be adequately served in heterogeneous middle grade classrooms, end quote. Studies in 1997, 2006, and 2007 also offer support to this effect. I'll quote from the 2006 study from Columbia University, because it's a big longitudinal study, and it found that, quote, the performance of initial high achievers did not differ statistically in the heterogeneous classes relative to previous homogeneous grouping, unquote, except in propensity to take AP exams. This means that the high-achieving kids were no worse off in an arrangement that had benefits for their lower-performing peers. Then there's a 2005 study of 9 years' worth of data from Wake County, North Carolina, yielding evidence that, quote, people who are high types appear to receive sufficient benefit from interacting with peers a bit below them that there is little reason to isolate them completely, end quote. Whether high achievers succeed or flounder in heterogeneous classes seems to come down to the pedagogy that teachers employ in those classes. When teachers effectively differentiate achievement for the full spectrum of learners, this is Carol Tomlinson, including advanced learners, rise markedly when compared to peer schools, where these approaches are not pervasive. This goes all the way back to Jean Oakes, who found that placement in classes labeled for high-ability students was not necessarily a guarantee of better learning. There's even a study in 2001 that found that when students are assigned to high-ability groups, the academic self-concept of boys, although interestingly, not girls, actually diminishes. In other words, they become less likely to take academic risks or to push themselves for fear of not living up to that label of advanced. I have definitely seen this phenomenon at work in my own honors classes. William Deresiewicz describes this problem really well in a 2008 article. If you're afraid to fail, this is a quote, you're afraid to take risks, which begins to explain the most damaging disadvantage of an elite education, that it is profoundly anti-intellectual, end quote. Dramatic statements aside, it would seem that high readiness as well as low readiness students might well have an interest in reforming or even removing the practice of ability level grouping, but simply increasing heterogeneity is not likely to improve student learning. Remember, it's all about how the classes are taught. According to the last big MetLife survey of the American teacher, that was from 2008, 43% of teachers agreed or strongly agreed with the statement, my class or classes in my school have become so mixed in terms of students' learning ability that I or other teachers can't teach them. And this was within ability grouped classes. So the question here is the same question that I faced in my own school. How can one design heterogeneous classrooms that support students at all readiness levels, including addressing both the learning needs and the college admissions concerns of high readiness students? Well, it's time to talk about differentiated instruction. I've been tossing that rather jargony phrase around without defining it for too long, so here we go. The biggest authority on differentiated instruction is, without a doubt, Carol Tomlinson. Right now, she's a professor at Curry College. In her previous life, she was Virginia's Teacher of the Year in 1974, and Outstanding Professor at Curry in 2004, and received an All-University Teaching Award in 2008. She's written 15 books on topics of differentiated instruction alone, and about 200 articles. So she's really the best place to begin. Differentiated instruction, in her words, is, quote, ensuring that what a student learns, how he or she learns it, and how the student demonstrates what he or she has learned is a match for that student's readiness level, interests, and preferred mode of learning. In Tomlinson's view, differentiated instruction is not teaching to the middle of a heterogeneous class. Rather, a classroom that successfully incorporates differentiated instruction has several key features. Most central is the ability for students, individually or cooperatively in groups, to work on different tasks as opposed to on a single, one-task-for-all class assignment. In Tomlinson's words, quote, differentiated instruction is a teaching philosophy based on the premise that teachers should adapt instruction to student differences. Rather than marching students through the curriculum lockstep, teachers should modify their instruction to meet students' varying readiness levels, learning preferences, and interests. End quote. Here's another quote from her. In the end, all learners need your energy, your mind, and your heart. They have that in common because they're young humans. How they need you, however, differs. Unless we understand and respond to those differences, we fail many students. So how do you know what your students need as a teacher in a differentiated classroom? To be sure, you'll need to do a lot of diagnostic and formative assessments. Our previous episode goes into great detail about what all that means, so do feel free to go back and reference that episode if you want. But in brief, diagnostic and formative assessments are ways for you to find out what students know, are able to do, and are interested in prior to any high-stakes assignments. Instead of thinking of assessment as a means for gatekeeping and judging, for determining if students have right answers and comparing them with the performance of others, one can also view assessment as for guiding, self-reflection, and information, such that students and teachers alike can adjust their strategies to make sure the most effective possible learning is happening. In a differentiated classroom, this means a lot of grouping and regrouping as students' needs change. Flexible grouping recognizes that students are part of many different groups and also work alone, based on the match of what they're doing to what they're ready for, or interested in, or what their preferred learning style is. Teachers can differentiate three main things for students: content, that is, what they're learning; process, how they're learning it; and product, what students are going to do or create to demonstrate that they understand whatever it is the teacher is trying to teach them. And they do this, as mentioned, according to students' readiness level, interests, or preferred learning style. Now, there's another phrase I keep slinging around that I really need to define. By learning style, I mean something kind of akin to Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. Howard Gardner is a Harvard professor who in 1983 put forward a theory that people don't have just an intellectual capacity, but have many different kinds of intelligence: visual, spatial, interpersonal, musical, linguistic, etc. And while more contemporary scholars really question just how much of an empirical basis there is for the strong version of the theory, in its lesser version, it recognizes the fact that sometimes we prefer to learn in one way versus another, maybe read something versus listening to it, or vice versa. And a savvy teacher in a differentiated classroom will strike a good balance between playing to a student's preferred learning style, especially when encountering new or particularly challenging material, and urging the student to push outside her comfort zone and try learning styles that might be less familiar or easily accessible. So, matching the work and the learning to the way that students learn best or most need to learn. That's the gist of differentiated instruction. The physical layout of the classroom needs to be able to facilitate this. So instead of students in rows and a teacher at the front of the room, an effective classroom for differentiation is going to be full of student-centered tables, groups, clusters, pods, set up with movable furniture that can easily be reconfigured. I've tried to employ differentiation as much as possible in my own teaching practice, recognizing that even in a class labeled honors or AP or remedial or whatever, students have a wide range of different needs and interests. I might differentiate by content for students when it comes to what readings I assign based on their reading readiness level. If our learning goal for the unit is to study characterization in fiction, then I might have students who come to me reading below grade level, reading a young adult book like The Hunger Games or even graphic novels and manga, while other students who come to me with a reading level at a much higher place might be reading Herman Melville or Emily Bronte. This is also a good chance to differentiate by interest. I've always had a problem with the traditional notion of a unit in an English class being structured around a book. Units should be structured around learning goals. Everyone will read The Great Gatsby is not a learning goal, unless the teacher's been told he has to teach it and then his goal is to not get fired. One class, one book, all at the same time and pace will inevitably bore some students, over-challenge others, and yes, engage some, but why not engage all of them? I also might differentiate by process when it comes to teaching a grammar concept. Some students can learn just fine by watching a video online. Others might need extensive one-on-one instruction from me, and others might learn better from their peers in small groups. I might differentiate by product, perhaps based on either interest or learning preference. I often let students demonstrate their understanding of, say, elements of fiction, things like plot, setting, theme, etc., by either writing an analytic essay that points out where and how an author has used these elements, or maybe writing a creative piece and then pointing out where and how they, as the author, use these elements. Or they can make an oral presentation or a video. I use the same rubric for all of them, and I assess and grade them all the same way, because I'm looking for the same thing, demonstrated knowledge of the elements of fiction. So there's no inherently easy or hard option. A student who might not be able to show me her knowledge through an essay, but actually does know the stuff, now has other ways to show me. It makes for more accurate assessment. Of course, if the learning goal is essay writing in itself, then all of my students will be writing essays. But then I'll give them options in how they choose topic or structure, things like that. Honestly, this is great for me, in that it saves me from having to read 100 nearly identical essays all about whether fate or free will govern the plot of Romeo and Juliet. If it sounds like this is making much more work for myself as a teacher, yes, it is, and I'd be lying if I said it was easy. I basically have to write several flavors of each and every lesson plan. But with every passing year, I find more and more evidence that this helps all students learn and makes the difference between actually teaching a class and just spending 50 minutes each day in a room full of students doing stuff. So that's differentiation in a nutshell. Now let's wind all of this back into the tracking and leveling discussion. Brian Stack, principal of Sanborn Regional High School in New Hampshire and author of a great book on competency-based learning called Breaking with Tradition, thinks there's a real problem with how traditional high school honors coursework is defined. Namely, it's defined by what course you take. In other words, you're in an honors class. That means you're an honors student. So everything you do must by definition be more challenging, more advanced, whatever. But Stack thinks that's wrong-headed. And instead, I quote from him, honors work can best be described as a product that shows that a student delved more deeply into methodology, structure, and/or theory, addressed more sophisticated questions, satisfied more rigorous standards. The content of an honors assignment can be one of two things. The content is either broader in scope or deeper in examination than a comparable assignment. End quote. So if what Stack is saying is the case, then you can have students all working together in the same class. No one gets stigmatized or made anxious by tracking and labels, but the students are also in that class all pursuing differentiated assignments, some of which are more challenging than others. And it's by doing these challenging assignments that any of them can earn honors distinction or credit or whatever. This would be a great time to check out episode 4 of my podcast if you haven't already, where I talk about the difference between lower order and higher order thinking. Some tasks like memorization and recall require less sophisticated thinking, less cognitive load, to use the EdSpeak term, than engaging in analysis or evaluation or in synthesizing ideas. To give students in your class, any of the students in your class, the option to pursue these more cognitively demanding tasks and be rewarded by some sort of credit or distinction is called embedding honors. And it's significant in many ways, not just because it prevents the evils of separating students by labels, but also because it ensures that people earning honors credit actually are doing more advanced work. There are schools that suffer from the Lake Wobegon effect, where 75% of the kids are in honors classes. What does that mean? And I can't count how many times I've had my own students in honors courses push back with some version of, hey, I already proved myself by getting into this class. Stop asking me to do all this work. Teachers often fear that heterogeneous classes will somehow dumb down learning for everyone. But if you differentiate and embed honors, defining that honors by the work that's being done and not by the course or the student, you actually increase the academic rigor of your course. Now, importantly, increasing the rigor doesn't just mean adding more work. In other words, if you're in a math class, getting embedded honors by doing 5 pages of problems for homework versus 2 pages like everyone else, that's not really the spirit of this. Rather, it should be that those problems are somehow more advanced or more demanding, and that's why you're earning that honors credit. If it's an English class or a history class, it can't be just that you're reading extra books to get honors. Maybe you're reading the same book as everyone else, but while everyone else is examining just that text itself, you're reading literary criticism or historical context and applying that to your understanding of the novel. At Stack School, where embedding honors is a common practice, engaging with those higher order thinking options doesn't mean that you as a student earn a higher grade. In other words, if you are applying literary criticism to your English text while someone else is just talking about the plot, it's not that you earn an A while they earn a B. Rather, by demonstrating highly successful completion of those tasks at each level, you wind up earning an A with honors credit, the other student winds up earning an A without honors credit. And since that other student can at any time try out those honors options, this doesn't necessarily create the same sort of harmful divisions that tracking does. If anything, that other student can see clearly what it takes to do honors level work. It's written right there on the assignments, as opposed to wondering by what mysterious calculus they got sorted into the non-honors bin by the registrar. Anyone can pursue excellence and be rewarded for it, assuming, of course, that the teacher is willing and able to engage with that student and help them to make progress towards those honors level goals. You can't just throw someone in the honors pool and expect them to swim if you don't teach them how. Naturally, the devil is in the details when it comes to the mechanics of how different schools that embed honors in their courses pull this off. Some have the students sign contracts from the outset of each course, or each academic quarter, putting them on an honors track within the class, which they then either stay on by completing the appropriate assignments or perhaps fall off, and hopefully have the chance to get back on later. At other schools, each and every unit offers a chance to earn honors credit, and if you earn it past some particular threshold, say 5 assignments or 10, then your report card grade reflects that honors GPA boost. It's crucial to get all the teachers on the same page at a school so students aren't trying to keep track of a dozen different paradigms and policies for embedding honors in their different classes, or that students in Teacher 1's class have the option to earn embedded honors while Teacher 2 is still teaching one-size-fits-all. That's inequitable. And of course, you also have to educate the parents and the community about all of this. Since embedding honors isn't the norm, yet, parents may be confused or anxious about their children's educational experience. You need clear and strong leadership from administration on down. The schools I've seen that have succeeded in implementing systems of embedded honors did it with all hands on deck, and those with a divided house, just as Honest Abe said, tended to fall apart. For over 30 years now, we've had clear and copious evidence that the system as it stands now, tracking and grouping and sorting students by perceived ability level, does harm to a great many children. Labeling some as promising and some as limited is just plain wrong. Any one of us who has spent time with students knows they frequently surprise us, forcing us to reassess our initial judgments of them. Changing the ways in which schools group students and the mechanisms by which teachers expect students to demonstrate learning yields a great many benefits, particularly to students who struggle in their schooling, but also, when constructed carefully and deliberately, to students who perform at the highest readiness levels. Classes with embedded honors might even provide the only option for challenging high readiness students at schools that are too small to support full sections of tracked classes. At any school, allowing every teacher access to working with students presenting with a wide range of readiness levels instead of assigning some teachers the good classes and some the tough ones could make for a dramatic improvement in teacher retention. It also prevents the tragic irony that often happens now when teaching honors classes is viewed as a reward for veteran teachers while rookie teachers, the least experienced, get assigned the highest need students as sort of a rite of passage, depriving those students who are in most need of experienced and competent teaching. That larger structures in the college admissions process and standardized testing might present certain obstacles to embedding honors is no excuse to shirk the responsibility to use the most effective possible methods, because, as I hope I've made a good case for, there are ways to maintain the benefits of a heterogeneous class within a traditional honors versus standard ranking system. There are existing successful configurations and teaching methods that make it possible for students at substantially different readiness levels to learn alongside one another. Finally, we're discovering that conceptualizing certain tasks and not certain students as simple or moderate or advanced enables students to view learning as something one achieves as opposed to an inherent quality of intelligence that one either possesses or lacks. This view not only opens the doors to a stimulating class for all students, providing them with more opportunities to acquire the skills and content that all of those state standards say they need to acquire, it also reveals, at a time when the challenges of the world demand innovation, a much wider and more promising view of human capacity. That's all the time we have for now. Class dismissed, and we'll see you next time. I hope you enjoy listening to this podcast. If you did, please write us a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever it is you found us. Like us on our Facebook page. And if you really enjoy it, please consider visiting our website, www.ed-infinitum.com, and making a donation to keep it running. Otherwise, in the grand tradition of underfunded public schools, we'll be reliant on only what we can make from bake sales. The website is the place to go if you want to suggest a topic or send me an email for any other reason. Our theme music is Happy Schoolmaster by Mind Music ID. Thanks again for listening, and remember, every day brings us opportunities to learn something new. Still with us? Good. In that case, you've got today's educational fun fact. The most literate city in the United States is Minneapolis, with Washington, D.C. and Seattle rounding out the top three. The most illiterate city in the United States? Long Beach, California, followed by Mesa, Arizona, and Aurora, Colorado. So, in between listening to podcasts, do take a moment to go read a good book. Bye now.